May as well do it. Hi, everybody. I'm really pleased to introduce Professor Lee Cronk. He comes from Rutgers University, where he's a professor of anthropology. And I invited Lee for this seminar series because he's really one of the premier investigators of culture in evolutionary perspective. And there's really nothing more difficult than that topic, I think. Lee got his BS at Northwestern University and then did an MS at University of Wisconsin-Madison, followed by a PhD at Northwestern. And he was a student of one of my favorite people in this business, Bill Irons. And Napoleon Chagnon was also at Northwestern in those days. So Lee really was exposed to some of the best minds in this business. His field work has been in Africa, in Kenya, among the Mukogodo and the Maasai. He's also done field work in Honduras, and then more recently in the American Southwest in Arizona and New Mexico among ranchers. He has published 3 single-authored books and 2 edited volumes. Let me just give you 1 or 2 titles. One of them is That Complex Whole: Culture and the Evolution of Human Behavior. Then from Mukogodo to Maasai, Ethnicity and Cultural Change in Kenya. That's 2 books, right? I'm not just running together, okay. No, and meeting at Grand Central, Understanding the Social and Evolutionary Roots of Cooperation. And then the edited volumes are Adaptation in Human Behavior, An Anthropological Perspective, and Through the Looking Glass, Readings in Anthropology. Currently, Dr. Cronk is the co-director of the Human Generosity Project. He and the other director, Athena Ectipis, they've had a $2 million grant from the Templeton Foundation. And this is leading to another book that I really look forward to reading. So I'm thrilled that we have Lee today talking to us about design principles for risk pooling systems. Okay, let's give him a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for the nice introduction, too. It's a great honor to be back here. I think the last time I was here was maybe 12 years ago. And there's a little bit of overlap in the audience, maybe, between then and now. And just not coincidentally, but that talk was sort of at the beginning of this research stream. I was just barely getting into it, and this is sort of the culmination of it, I would say. So let me begin by talking about the team that we were able to put together thanks to the grant from the Templeton Foundation that you just heard about. So Athena Ectipis is my main collaborator on all this stuff. She's a psychologist at Arizona State University. And then the money that we got enabled us to put together a team. This is not an exhaustive list of everybody who's sort of participated in the project over the years, but I think this is everybody who's been on a publication that contributes to this talk. And if you want details about any of these folks, you can check out our website or just Google them. And I'll talk about some of them as the talk goes by as well, but I just want to give them credit for all the work they did. So we have basically 3 ways of doing research plus outreach. I don't have any slides about the outreach, but I can talk about it if you want me to. It's pretty interesting, I think. We do laboratory and online experiments. We do agent-based models or computer simulations. And we do field work at sites around the world. This is pretty accurate representation of those sites, plus maybe 1 or 2 more recent ones that haven't been added yet. And I'll talk about most of that as the talk goes by. So how do you manage risk? According to people who write textbooks that are read by people who are going to work for insurance companies, there's 4 ways. That's where we got this framework. One is risk retention. That would be storing up resources for future use in the case of an emergency. So in this case, in this depiction, these folks are getting ready for a hurricane or something along those lines, so they're stocking up on food and water. If your economy was based on livestock, which is true of some of the folks I'll talk about today, then you would do this by having large herds. Herds that may appear to be larger than they need to be for everyday needs, but the reason why you need a large herd is because you never know when a drought's gonna hit or a disease is gonna hit and wipe out 2/3 of them. If you are an institution in the United States these days, a big one like the University of Michigan, you simply do this by having an endowment, having resources in money and investments, so that you may not even bother to buy insurance. You just self-insure. So self-insurance is another way of talking about risk retention. Risk avoidance would be staying out of the way of risk. Don't drive on the roads when they're icy. Stay home when it's late at night and driving might be hazardous. Just avoid the risk. Risk reduction would be to take steps to reduce your exposure to the risk. Wear a bike helmet, put on your safety belt when you're driving your car, things like that. Those are all well and good, and I won't talk about any of them anymore today, maybe a little bit about risk retention. The one that's interesting from a social science perspective is risk transfer, because it's the only one that requires social interaction. The other ones may involve social interaction, but risk transfer requires it. It means that you are agreeing with somebody to take on their risk or vice versa, or maybe both simultaneously. So commercial insurance is how risk transfer happens in today's American economy for the most part. If you feel like you're exposed to possible risks in the future, to your car, to your home, to your health, you get an insurance policy and you pay your premiums, right? And the company agrees that if something bad happens, you can file a claim and get reimbursed. But it also covers grassroots risk pooling, systems where people simply agree to cover each other's needs if something bad happens to them. And those happen all around the world. Extremely, ubiquitous might be an exaggeration, but extremely commonplace all around the world. Mostly in small scale societies these days, because in societies like ours, commercial insurance and the welfare state have kind of displaced them. But not exclusively. So I will talk about some examples of risk pooling from societies like ours. And in a risk pool, people agree to help each other when they are in need. And that is what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the talk, risk pools. So before I get to that, an evolutionary element, for those who care about evolution, is there risk pooling among non-humans? Yes, at least one case. The best documented case of it that I'm aware of is central place food sharing in vampire bats. Many of you may be aware of this already, thanks to the work of two guys named Jerry Wilkinson at Maryland and his former student, Jerry Carter at Ohio State. They've got vampire bats in cages and they provision them with blood. And so they can watch their interactions in great detail and have been doing so for like 40 years. So thanks to the two Jerrys, we know that they share blood with each other. And the reason they do this is because the risk that they're exposed to is starving. If you're a vampire bat, what you want to do is go out at night, try to find an animal, typically a mammal. I think there's some that specialize in birds, but typically a mammal. And if you're lucky enough, you can make an incision, say around here, and lap up the blood. But that doesn't happen all the time. There's a pretty good chance you're going to come home to the roost with an empty stomach. And if you do that, you're going to die if you don't get food within like 36 hours. And so what they will do is the ones who are lucky enough to have had a meal and have a full stomach will regurgitate blood for the ones that have not. So they're keeping that other one alive. And there's some kin selection going on here. Some of these folks are relatives. But another reason to keep somebody alive, even if they're not your relative, is so that they're there the next night in case you come home with an empty stomach. They're there to help you. So they're pooling the risk of possible starvation by sharing the food. Humans figured this out too, sometime during our evolution. Fortunately, we did it a different way than regurgitating for each other. We can carry stuff. So what we do, what our ancestors figured out to do, is what's called central place provisioning. Same thing as central place food sharing, just a more technical term, which means that people in the camp, in the hunting and gathering camp, if they're able to go foraging during the day, they do. And as they go foraging, they eat as they go, take care of themselves. Sometimes they eat quite a bit. This has been documented recently by one of our team members following Hadza. The Hadza are a group of hunters and gatherers in Tanzania that were part of our project. They're these folks on the right. And she documented that they do eat as they go, and sometimes they eat quite a bit, but they also bring back surplus. And that surplus goes to anybody who either was unable to forage that day because they're too old, too young, too burdened by caring for others, small children say, or just unlucky. They went foraging and they didn't have any luck. So everybody gets taken care of, ideally, and they're able to go out foraging the next day. Or then if they can recover from disease the next week or so, whatever it might be. This is quite different from how our most closest relatives work. So the closest living relatives we have are chimps and bonobos, and they do share a little bit of food. And this was fairly famous in the primatology literature, meat sharing among chimpanzees and so on. But it's a very small amount of food. And they don't do it in this way. They don't do central place food sharing. And so if you're a chimp or a bonobo, if you're weaned, you're pretty much on your own for your subsistence. You have to get your own food. And if you find yourself unable to do that because you're sick or you're injured, tough. Nobody's going to bring you food. You might just starve to death if it lasts long enough. So our ancestors figured out what arguably a better way to do it, now that we're the descendants of the system, where you take care of those who happen to be in need so they can help you in the future, and the whole group gets along better. This leads to an opportunity for the evolution of lots of things that are part of our everyday life these days, like a slower life history pattern, higher fertility, longer lifespans, shorter interbirth intervals, cooperative breeding, all these kinds of things. So this was an innovation which was huge. It doesn't fossilize. You can't find it in the archaeological record, unlike stone tools and fire and so on. So it doesn't always get the credit it deserves. But as a behavioral innovation and a social innovation, it was huge. Very, very important to our success. This also seems to have shaped our psychology. The reason I say that is because in experimental situations, it's very easy to get people to figure this out and to realize that helping others is a good idea for themselves. And we know this in part to an experiment that was run by Hilly Kaplan and his colleagues, 2012, where they gave people a virtual environment. You know, they're sitting at a computer and they're pretending to be foragers in an environment that is either one with high volatility of resources or low volatility of resources. So in the low volatility situation, resources are reliable. You have not very much incentive to share resources with others because those others aren't likely to be in need very much because resources are reliable. In the high volatility environments, there's a lot of unpredictability to who's going to succeed, who's not going to succeed. And people very quickly grasp the idea that it behooves you to help those in need because you might need them in the future. Times have changed and people figured out ways of pooling risk on longer time scales. This may have started when we were still mostly hunting and gathering. And I say that because one of the best examples of this is from the Jungkwanzi or Kung or Kung people. These are hunting and gathering peoples, or these days former hunting and gathering peoples living in Botswana and Namibia. And we know about their system of sort of longer term sharing called Sharo, thanks mostly, not exclusively, but mostly to the work of Polly Wiesner, who we are fortunate to have on the Human Generosity Project's board of scientific advisors. So she's documented how the Sharo system works. And the way it works in very simple terms is that as you go through your life, you cultivate Sharo partners, people across the landscape that you exchange small gifts with. The nature of the gifts isn't really very important. It could be a piece of jewelry, it could be an arrowhead, it could be a variety of things. The point of the gift is not the gift itself, but the maintenance of the relationship. And so within our little project's internal terminology, we would refer to that as a bond-based transfer. That the point of that small gift is to maintain the bond. And the reason why you want to do that is because the future is unpredictable. And you may find yourself and people in your camp in a position that's untenable because of a shortage of food locally or shortage of water locally, but you've got relationships with people farther away. And so you can move to where your Sharo partners are, and they have an obligation, thanks to this relationship that you've agreed upon, to help you out if they're able to do so, if they're in a better situation. So they're still hunting and gathering, they're still doing the daily central place food sharing, but they also have this longer term and greater spatial scale relationship as well. The healthcare sharing ministries, This is something that we actually in the project have studied and we have data on, but it's not been analyzed, so I don't have much to say about it. Healthcare sharing ministries are an American phenomenon. The first one started in Ohio in the early 1980s or so. There's dozens of them these days. They're organizations, formally organized corporate organizations, nonprofit, that bring people together, usually faith-based, that's why they're called ministries. And the members of the organizations agree to pay each other's medical bills. So when the Affordable Care Act was passed, whenever that happened, there was a loophole in it for these organizations. So you didn't have to get insurance if you're a member of one of them. And they still exist. And again, we've done interviews with members and we've done a survey of members and of non-members to be able to compare the two. But I don't have much to say about it because it hasn't been analyzed yet. The third one up here, I am grateful to my nephew, Max, who's over there. Max van Oostenburg, who has a PhD in anthropology, for those of you in academia, from the University of Florida about a year ago. But in between his master's degree and his PhD, he had a job doing research funded by NOAA in Seattle studying fishermen. And one of the things he learned through that job, he shared with me years ago, was that Northwest Coast fishermen engage in what they call bycatch sharing. So bycatch, that's the fish you don't want to catch. You go out fishing aiming for the commercial species that you can sell, and there's government-imposed quotas on those, of course, to maintain the stocks. But there's also government-imposed quotas on those other species of fish that you don't really want to catch, because those are also protected. And the way it's supposed to work is that if you meet your bycatch quota, you have to stop fishing. The fishermen in some communities figured out that they could pool their bycatch so that everybody in the community has to reach that bycatch limit, and then they stop fishing. So everybody in the community gets to fish for longer that way. Not necessarily the best thing for the fish, but the best thing for the fishermen, given the rules that have been put on. Is that a fair assessment? Pretty good? Okay, great. Pando. So Pando is a for-profit corporation that pools risk of a different kind, of a positive kind, because you don't have to only pool negative things. You can pool positive things. And there's a sense in which hunters and gatherers do this with big dead animals. So big game animals, that's a positive thing when that happens, when somebody's lucky enough to get a big animal. So they pool that positive risk. In the case of Pando, there's certain careers that you might decide to take where there's a possibility that you might hit it rich, but there's also a possibility, a greater possibility that you won't. And the best example of this, and the one they focused on initially, is minor league baseball players. So minor league baseball players get paid very poorly, but every once in a while, one of them gets very lucky and is obviously skilled as well, and makes it to the major leagues. And what Panda will do is get together groups of friends, essentially, friends within the minor league community, and pool them together, have them sign a contract agreeing to pool together, so that if any one of them makes it to the major leagues, 10% of their income goes to everybody else in the pool. Pando gets a cut as well, of course. It's a for-profit corporation. They've also tried to set up pools. I don't know how successful they've been with other folks like, they're based in San Francisco, so like Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, people going to business school at Stanford, say. Are they gonna hit it rich? Are they not? Well, you can pool their risks together, and if any one of them gets rich, the rest benefit as well, if they agree to be in the pool. And then the final one up here, I'm gonna talk about at length, is the Osotwa system among Ma-speaking peoples. And let me just move on to the next slide. So Osotwa, it's not on the slide here, but what it means, literally, is an umbilical cord, a human umbilical cord. And they use it metaphorically to refer to these relationships, these risk pooling relationships they have with people. And that metaphor is obviously very evocative and sacred, in the sense that the mother-fetus bond is a sacred bond. But it leaves it ambiguous as to who is the mother and who is the offspring at any one moment. So, because the help could go either way. So it involves gifts and favors of many kinds. This is from interviews I did back in 2005. Gifts and favors of many kinds, but it's a livestock-based economy, so mostly livestock. Inkanyet, that word in parentheses there, is the word for respect, which is the most important concept in Maasai social relations. You're supposed to carry yourself with respect and treat others with respect. They take that very seriously. In one of my interviews, gave me this nice quote: Osoto and Enkanye go together, Osoto in the lead and Enkanye behind. Another one said it's weighty. Keiroshi means it's heavy. In other words, it's a big responsibility. It involves gifts requested due to real needs. Sina means need or poverty. You don't just ask for gifts or give gifts because you want to. These aren't bond-based transfers. You give a gift only if your Osoto partner has asked for one, and they're only allowed to ask for one if they are truly in need. It involves gifts and favors given freely. So if you are able to help, if you're not able to help, you can say that. But if you're able to help, then you're supposed to not be stingy about it, not begrudgingly give, but give freely. Peisho means freely, and from the heart, l'tao. They do have the concepts of payment. Alak is the word for to pay, and sile is the word for debt. They have those concepts. They use those concepts in other contexts, but they're adamant that they're not appropriate to be used within Osoto relationships. You don't use those words in this context because that's not what it's about. It's not about paying anybody or creating debt. So there is a sense of reciprocity or a reciprocal obligation to help the others, but only if they happen to be in need. So there's no expectation of a balance in terms of the amounts given from one partner to the other. If one partner is lucky and the other one is unlucky, and that happens over and over again in that same way, that's okay. The lucky one is happy to be the lucky one, and the unlucky one is unfortunate to be the unlucky one. But there's no expectation that they're going to get repaid, because the situation in which you get repaid is if you yourself are in need, and you don't want to be the needy one. You want to be the one who's lucky all the time. So this is the system that I know the best and that this whole project got off the ground with. So I do have a lot to say about it. Moving on. So this is the article that this talk is based on, Design Principles for Risk Pooling Systems. Came out a couple of years ago in Nature Human Behavior. And some of you were forced to read it. Thanks for doing that. But it's this culmination of research we've been doing for years and been publishing along the way. So I'm just going to put up a bunch of paper titles here, just so that you know that there's other papers that are feeding into this. I'm not going to go through each one of these in detail. They're all posted on the Human Generosity Project website if you want to see any of them. But I just want to kind of, again, give credit to all these co-authors on all these papers who contributed to all this stuff. Then I want to also give credit to Elinor Ostrom. So I think many of you know who Elinor Ostrom was. If you don't, she was a very important political scientist who also won the Nobel Prize in Economics. Only political scientists to do that, I think. And the reason she won it is because she figured out how common pool resource management schemes work. So common pool resources are things like, again, the fisheries management, that's a common pool resource, or irrigation water or forest. She figured out that communities around the world have come up with ways of managing these resources sustainably. And she boiled it all down into 7, sometimes 8, there's another one, sometimes get mentioned, design principles. So when Athena and I said, well, we have design principles too, so let's use that language. I'm not going to talk about her design principles. I'm going to talk about our design principles for risk pooling systems. And so we have 7 as well. That's just a coincidence. And I'm going to talk about each of these in detail, so I'm going to move on from this slide right away. So the first one is the participants should agree that the pool is for needs that arise unpredictably, not for routine predictable needs. This is something that emerged, we didn't figure this out ahead of time. This emerged from talking to people who pool risk. And out of the interviews we did with a group of ranchers in Arizona and New Mexico, I'll show you a slide of them in a minute, we came up with this prediction that there seemed to be a relationship between the predictability of the timing of the need. Is it something that happens on a schedule, or can you put it on a schedule? That would mean that the predictability would be high. Or is it something that happens from out of the blue and there's no way to know when it's going to happen? It's unpredictable. That would be a low predictability. And then the y-axis is the donor's expectation of repayment for aid provided. Does the donor generally, when providing aid, expect that aid to be repaid at some point in the future, or do they not? And again, based on what we were hearing from the ranchers, we said, okay, let's predict this, that if the thing is predictable, You can schedule it, or it already comes with a schedule. People are going to expect repayment because then they can swap favors back and forth, right? If you got kids and they got to get to school, you can form a carpool and you can swap the favor of hauling the kids to school. And you know when that's going to happen. That's predictable. On the other hand, sometimes people are needy unpredictably. They get sick, they get injured. In those cases, we predict people are just going to help, and they're not going to expect to get repaid because, again, the only circumstance in which you would get repaid is if something bad happens to you, and you don't want that to happen. So just to give you, let me set up the ranchers a little bit here. So this is a weekly steer roping competition that takes place outside the town of Animas in New Mexico in the summer months. The region here is this far southeastern corner of Arizona and the far southwestern corner of New Mexico. And it's a very sparsely populated region with very low productivity of land. So in order to be a rancher out here, you have to have a lot of land. So they measure the ranches in square miles, not in acres, but square miles. And they might have a lot of square miles because there's very little productivity there. And so when you're actually driving around the region to go talk to the ranchers, you don't see cattle very often. It's a pretty rare thing to actually see a cow because they're off somewhere in the landscape, typically very often on federal land or state land that they lease, and grazing, getting fed and reproducing. But at certain points in the year, you're going to need to round them up. So one way you could do that would be to just be a big ranch and have a lot of people working on the ranch all the time. Very few ranches do that, even some quite large ones, because you got to maintain that labor force year round. So mostly the ranches are family owned, and the families have enough labor that they can maintain the ranches on a day-to-day basis. But at certain times of the year, you're going to have to round those livestock up and brand them, vaccinate them, or round the livestock up so that you can ship them off to market. And that's going to require a lot of people with horses and with skills. And one way you could fulfill that would be to go on the market and hire people, just hire cowboys that you don't know. And there are people available that you could hire for that purpose, but they mostly don't do that. They avoid that. And the reason they say that is because they don't know those people's skills. They don't know for sure those people have the right skill set. And at least a couple of ranchers said that a saying they have is that one man who don't know cattle is like two good men gone. So if you have somebody on your crew who doesn't know what they're doing, it's worse than having two men not on your crew, or two women. Women get involved too, as you can see here. So rather than that, they ask their neighbors for help because they know their neighbors. They've known them for years. They know their neighbors have the skills. And so when it's time to get the animals rounded up, they send the word out to their neighbors. They used to do this at church, and then they did it over the phone. And now when we were there a few years ago, they were doing it through social media. But the neighbors find out that there's a need on a ranch at a particular point in time for help, and then they turn up. And this may mean neighbors are anybody within about a 2-hour driving radius of anybody. So they'll get up at like 2 o'clock in the morning, load up their horses, load up their gear, and drive a couple of hours so that they're there to help all day long with the ranch. And when they do this, as you'll see on the next slide, most of them expect that will be reciprocated, that will be repaid. But sometimes they help each other for other reasons. When there's a labor shortage on a ranch because somebody gets sick or somebody gets injured or somebody dies in the family. The biggest risk that most people talked about was injuries because it's very easy to get injured here. You've got cattle, and the cattle are basically wild. They're not like nice dairy cows that you can pet. They're basically wild. There's the horses, there's the humans, and these days there's a lot of heavy equipment as well, and that can be dangerous. So there's a lot of injuries, and so a very common reason to help out another ranch just any time of year out of the blue is because somebody got injured. So we took all that from the interviews and we used that to design a mail survey that we sent out to people with brands registered with Arizona and New Mexico. You have to do that if you're a rancher, you have to register your brand. And we broke it down into 10 either types of helping or reasons why somebody might help. And then we ordered these according to how predictable or unpredictable these things are according to the responses in the survey. So on the left-hand side, you have things that most people consider them to be very predictable. Again, there's always a small minority that will buck the trend and say, oh, even that is unpredictable. But branding, you know when that's going to happen, you can schedule that. Shipping your livestock off to market, you know when that's going to happen, you can schedule it. Transporting, some of these ranches have discontinuous bits. They're not all contiguous. And so you might have to transport from one chunk to another. Gathering the livestock in order to do these things. All these things are very predictable. There's some things in the middle here. Fences means repairing fences. Returning means returning livestock to their rightful owner because they got on your land because of a broken fence typically, or maybe somebody left a gate open. And then equipment failure, your pump fails, your wagon fails, something like that. Those are kind of in between, not super predictable, not super unpredictable. The unpredictable ones are injury, illness, and death. And then that's the red. And then the blue is, do they expect repayment or not? And there's always some people, you notice these lines don't go up to 1, it's just 0.7, because there's always some people who say, I never expect repayment for anything I do, no matter what the reason. And they stick to that when they reply to the survey. Small number. And then there's always a small number of people who say, no matter what the reason why I give help, I always expect repayment. Small number. The people in between are the ones that go back and forth and say, okay, if the reason I'm giving help is something that's predictable, then I expect to be repaid for that. If I'm helping somebody with their branding and then I need help with my branding, I expect help with that, help with the branding. And one rancher said, well, if that happens one time that I don't get repaid for the branding, I'll let that slide. But if it happens 2 times, no, not let that slide. That's done. That relationship is over. And then there's, on the other hand, if you're helping somebody just because they had an injury in the family, most people do not expect repayment. Again, the circumstance in which you would get repayment would be if somebody in your family is injured and you don't want that to happen. And so you hopefully don't get repaid for that. So I'm going to pause and give you an analogy. So expecting to get repaid for something would be like a bank loan. A bank gives you a loan because they've looked at your collateral and they think you're good for it, and they're going to make a profit off that. So they're incentivized to give you something because they're going to get something back. Otherwise, they wouldn't do it. Insurance policy, on the other hand, you get an insurance policy for things that are unpredictable. And when you do that, you don't want to get your money back. You want to be the lucky person who never files a claim and never gets any money back. But the future is unpredictable and you're prudent, hence prudential insurance, and you go ahead and get your policy and you pay your premiums. So need-based transfers or this kind of situation, that's like an insurance policy. The other one is a little bit more like a bank loan, a rough analogy. So one of our grad students, Diego Guevara-Batran, said, okay, well, is this just the ranchers or does this generalize to other folks? So he set up an online survey of people, just Americans in general, not ranchers. And he changed the sorts of reasons why somebody might be needy to fit that circumstance. So nothing to do with ranching, more to do with everyday life in America. And basically replicated. Again, there are some people who say, no matter why I give help, I don't expect repayment, or no matter why I give help, I do expect repayment. But in between those people is where you can see the effect, or if it is a need that is perceived to be unpredictable, people are more likely to say, I don't expect repayment for that. Or perhaps they say, we got a little bit more sophisticated in how we ask the question with this one. Do you expect repayment, but only if you have a similar need in the future, like emotional support? Like basically, I don't expect repayment for emotional support, but in the future, if I need emotional support, it'd be nice to get help. Then you get the same effect that you get among the ranchers. Basically, that graph shows essentially the same effect as among the ranchers. So based on that, we think it's broadly applicable to people in general. We haven't done quite the same thing overseas yet, though. So that's number 1. So I've got 6 to go through. Number 2, participants should take care of their own needs before helping others. So this is something we're all familiar with because we've all been on airplanes. And you're supposed to put your own mask on if this happens. Fortunately, I've never been on a plane where this happened, fingers crossed. But if it does happen, I know, put my own mask on before I help anybody else, because if I pass out, I'm not good to anybody. So the same is true in all these risk pooling systems. If you're not taking care of yourself and your resources and your ability to help others, you're no good to those other people. So take care of yourself first. So one way this manifests itself, I've mentioned this already, among hunter-gatherers, this is a Hadza guy eating a berry off a tree. You eat as you go. You take care of yourself first, because otherwise you're not good to anybody. In like Maasai, like any livestock-based economy, you do this by taking care of your livestock. So another way you could pool risk in a livestock-based economy would be to pool the livestock themselves, to create a common pool resource management problem by treating the livestock as common property and pooling them together and managing them collectively with everybody else. If you did that, then you would have to read Eleanor Ostrom's book and realize that that's not a good idea. So if you can find a way to avoid that, you should, because it's hard. An easier way to do things is to keep the livestock private. So all the livestock is privately owned, which gives the owner of the livestock an incentive to manage the livestock effectively, which benefits the owner of the livestock, but it also benefits the owner's risk pooling partners, because then that guy is there. It gets usually, in these pastoral societies, it's usually men owning the livestock, to help his OSIPA partners. Let's see. So that's number 2. Number 3, giving to those in need should not create an obligation for them to repay. We've already kind of covered this a little bit. I'll just elaborate on it some. So this is the Hadza. This is a quote from something by James Woodburn, who was sort of the classic ethnographer of the Hadza. He said that we have no debt, they say, only the general right to share is carried forward over time, specific claims are not. So they're very adamant that the lack of debt among Hadza is sort of a mark of being Hadza, that they don't create debt through the sharing that they do at the camp. A little jargon that you've already seen, I'll just make sure you understand what it means. We invented this stuff to try to be clearer than we could with existing jargon. A debt-based transfer, a need-based transfer at the top there is transfers inspired by the neediness of the recipient with no expectation of repayment. That's what we mean when we use that phrase. Debt-based transfers mean transfers inspired by a desire to eventually be paid back. And through our simulations, we've been able to show that if you're in a volatile environment, that's key. You got to be in an environment where there's some unpredictability to the future, that need-based transfers pool risk better than debt-based transfers. So we've done this with, the simplest ones we've done is what you see here, because they're the easiest one to look at. But we've also done it on networks of different sizes. And it always, no matter what, as long as the environment is volatile, then the need-based transfers are working better than the debt-based transfers. And the reason is pretty simple too, which I'll talk about here. So on the left-hand side, you've got no transfers. You got just 2 agents, and they're going through life together in the same simulation, but they're just maintaining their own herds as best they can. They basically start out with a certain number of animals, and then those animals grow from year to year. And then every once in a while, they get hit by a shock, simulating a drought or something like that. But there's no relationship between how long they're lasting, and ultimately, they don't really last very long because they're not helping each other. That's a baseline. In the middle, you've got 2 individuals who are engaging in debt-based transfers with each other. So that means that they are helping each other when they're in need, but they're expecting repayment. And I think in this simulation, we set it up that they had to get repaid within 5 rounds, or they cut off the relationship. And so that improves things. They're lasting a little bit longer, and their fates are yoked together a little bit. But it's not improving things as much as it could, because they're cutting off the relationships. By cutting off the relationships, they're ending any chance that that other individual could help them. So a better policy is the one on the right-hand side, that you just engage in need-based transfers. You help the one who's in need, and you don't worry about getting repaid. You just maintain the relationship, because you're going to need them in the future. And these are logarithmic scales. So if you could stretch them out, you could see that the difference is really quite dramatic, that you last a lot longer if you're engaging in need-based transfers. So much so that my suspicion is that pastoralism as a way of life, especially pastoralism in marginal environments, wasn't really possible until people developed risk pooling relationships, that it was a thing that had to emerge or they weren't going to make it. You have to be able to, you have to help others out. There we go. Okay. Number 4 is that the resources that are crucial to the system should either be visible to all concerned or made visible to all concerned. And this brings us to the topic of cheating. So there's two ways to cheat in a risk pooling system. One is to be greedy and ask for help when you don't really need it. And the other one is to be stingy and not give help when you actually could help. And both of these may be tempting. In the long run, it's a bad idea because if you're in a volatile environment, you need to help those in need because you're going to need them in the future. But in the short run, these could be tempting. One way you can avoid these is to start with resources that are publicly visible. So among pastoralists, this is livestock. Livestock cannot be hidden, right? You look at somebody's herds, you have a very good idea of how rich they are. With hunting and gathering peoples, there are opportunities to hide small packaged foods, small animals, maybe a little bit of honey, some fruit, stuff, and so on. And there's evidence that they do that sometimes when they want to direct those resources more to their family, say. But big animals, big dead animals, cannot be hidden. Those have to be shared because everybody knows they're there. So that's one way to start. If those things are not present, you're going to have a hard time. And we showed experimentally that if you change the situation from where resources are visible to one where they're not visible, people do start to cheat. So this was done in an online experiment where we had people pretend to be pastoralists. So they have virtual livestock. They grow over the years. They get hit by shocks. And then they can help each other or not help each other as things go by. And as long as the resources are visible, people get it and they help each other. They understand that this is a volatile environment and you need to help the other one because you never know when you're going to be in need. You need that person. Because the longer they last in the game, the more money they make. There's an incentive there. But when the resources are hidden, this is a complicated set of graphs, but I'm just going to tell you what they say. When the resources are hidden, people do exactly what you would think they would do. They start asking for resources when they don't really need them, and they start not giving resources when they actually could. Perhaps because they suspect that the other party isn't really needy. So both of these things are problems, and these sorts of systems can and do fall apart when resources change from being visible to being hidden. So when an economy goes from one in which there's no cash and all the resources are visible to be shared, then to a situation where there is cash, then they may fall apart. And I think I have some slides on that later. The fifth one is there should be a consensus among participants regarding what constitutes real need. This one is, I think, probably the trickiest of all because the concept of need is going to vary so much depending on your local situation, your local economy. And so if you were to say transport a group of Hadza here, then they would be perceived as being incredibly needy. You know, they're living out on the land, barely any shelter, barely any resources, any tools even. But that's not how they perceive it. As long as they're getting food every day, making it as Hadza, the way the Hadza make it, they are not perceiving that need. So could be huge differences across different groups in how this is perceived. Even among one culturally more or less homogenous group, the Maasai, there's differences. Not all Maasai are wealthy. So these photos of these livestock I showed you on the previous slides were taken among a wealthy group of Maasai, the Loita, where I had a grad student, 2 grad students actually, who were Loita. They have lots of livestock. And so they have one concept of what neediness needs among them. I study another group called the Mukogoto, who are quite poor. They just recently became pastoralists. They used to be hunters and gatherers. So their livestock herds are still quite small. They're quite poor. And so they have a different idea of what constitutes needs. So there's potential here for conflict. And the way it's handled in that situation is they simply live apart. There's a residential segregation by wealth among Maasai. And so the Mukogoto and other people like them live in different places than the rich people do. And they form their relationships more or less locally. They do have relationships that cross these boundaries, but they're mostly marriage. And those are important, but they're not social relationships. So even though this is difficult, there is literature out there by other people, not my team, that gives me hope that it's not intractable, that we can come to some consensus about why some people are considered needy and some people not. So one person who's done research on this is Michael Bang-Petersen. He's a political scientist from Denmark. And so he said, okay, the Danish welfare state is relatively generous and the American welfare state is relatively stingy. Maybe that's due to a cultural difference between Danes and Americans regarding perceptions of need. So he set up an experiment in which he ran vignettes past Americans and Danes about people who were in need for different reasons. So one guy is depicted as being in need through no fault of his own. He simply got sick. He wasn't able to work because of that. Is he deserving of need? Another is depicted as in need very much through his own fault because he's lazy and he doesn't want to work. And despite Michael Bang-Petersen's expectation that there might be some difference between Danes and Americans, there wasn't. Both respondents, groups of respondents, said the one who is in need through no fault of his own is truly in need and he should be helped. The other one who's in need because he's lazy, no. There was consensus on that. So Danes and Americans aren't very far apart culturally, really, in the great scheme of things. But at least those two groups have come to somewhat of an agreement based on this one study. There's another team that I don't know as well. I know Michael, but I don't know these people, Muleman et al., who have developed what they call the Karen framework. I wish they need to come up with something that starts with a G, so it can be the caring framework, but they haven't done that yet. So it's just the Karen framework. They're caring about things for determining deservingness. Control, is the person in control or not in control? That's like what Michael Bang-Petersen was addressing. Is it something you could have prevented or not? Attitude, do they have a positive attitude of gratitude if they're helped? Is there reciprocity? Is there some chance they might be able to repay in the future? That increases people's likelihood to see them as deserving of help. Identity, are they part of your group? People are more likely to see group members as deserving of need than members of some other group. And are they truly in need? Is the need actually measurable and palpable? According to them and their research, all of these things feed into an ultimate calculation of a party's deservingness. So there's hope. And there we go. Number 6. Individuals should be able to accept or deny partnerships based on such factors as whether attitudes about risk are within an acceptable range. So this is less crucial, I would say, because say in a hunting and gathering society, your ability to choose your risk pooling partners is limited because you're going to do it with whoever's in your camp. There is fluidity in camp memberships, though. People move like the Hadza. They move from camp to camp quite a bit. Some of those moves are motivated by a feeling that they're not being appreciated as much as they should be for the contributions they're making. But their ability to choose is limited. The Maasai, on the other hand, have, I would say, complete ability to choose whether they want to partner up with somebody or not. And so they have a process, so this sort of analogous a bit to a courtship process, where you get to know people as you grow up, and you give gifts to people, these little friends of yours as you're a child, and develop relationships with them that way. And then when you become an adult, you may or may not decide that you're OSOTO partners. So this taps into a whole big literature, huge literature on cooperative partner choice. I'm not going to talk about that whole literature, just suffice it to say that there's a large literature about how people choose their cooperative partners. And people are pretty good at it, even when given minimal cues. There are just a couple of papers on this. My research collaborator, Athena, and I, she for her dissertation did this sort of thing. She took the prisoner's dilemma game. I'm going to assume people know what that is, cooperative game. And she was, as far as I know, the first person to have their agents play it in space. So these are agents that cannot just interact with other agents because they're stuck, but they can move around in space and find other agents that are like them in terms of their cooperative tendencies. And this enhanced their ability to find cooperative partners and to cooperate. And then there's a paper by Hamlin et al. That I like a lot, social evaluation by preverbal infants. The reason I like it is because it was with babies, 6-month-old and 10-month-old babies. So these are, there's very little chance that they have been taught anything explicitly about cooperative partner choice. But if you give them a situation in which they have been shown toy-like objects helping each other or hindering each other as they try to achieve a goal going up a hill. And then you give them a choice of toy to play with. They almost always pick the toy depicted as helping. They almost never, again, there's always a few, pick the toy depicted as hindering. So even very early on, people have a tendency to be sensitive to signs of cooperative partners. Final one here, ideally risk-pooling partners should be exposed to dissimilar risks, especially in terms of their temporal distribution. So ideally, if I'm hit by some catastrophe, you're not. And so you can help me and vice versa. So if you have a very small, so you want to scale up. Essentially, if you have degrees of scale and you have a very small risk-pooling group and some catastrophe hits, you might all get wiped out and then nobody can help anybody. If you have a bigger group, then a few people are left who could help. That's good. Ideally, you want to go all the way up and again, have the same size catastrophe, but plenty of people in the risk pool. There's difficulties with larger risk pools in that they may increase the opportunities for being stingy or being greedy because you don't know these people as well. It may be logistically difficult because they're far away, but ideally you do this. And we do this in the real world. So this is Hurricane Sandy as it approached the eastern seaboard in 2012, I think it was. And my house is right about there. And if you zoom in like this, then it was catastrophic to everybody in the picture, right? It was pretty bad. But if you zoom out, the rest of the United States is doing all right. And they can help. And indeed, they did help through the government, through the Red Cross, and so on and so forth. And if you zoom out even farther, then the rest of the world is doing all right as well. And again, we do these days, thanks to improvements in logistics, pool risk on a worldwide basis through Red Cross, Oxfam, governments, and so on and so forth. And even small scale societies can do this to some extent. One of our field sites was in Fiji. And the problem, they have a variety of problems. One of the big problems is that they're in Cyclone Alley. So these are hurricanes. They don't call them hurricanes there. They're tropical cyclones. But they get hit by them on a regular basis. But when they hit, they don't hit evenly. So one village may be hit very hard, and then the next village over on the other side of the island might be okay. So they maintain relationships between villages through what I, again, would call bond-based transfers. They have ceremonies where they exchange important ceremonial objects. This is one that this guy's handling. It's called a tambua. It consists of a sperm whale tooth with a leather rope, thong attached to it. And the idea of it is that the weight of the tooth symbolizes the seriousness, the weightiness of the relationship, and the thong represents the bond, right? So they give these types of things back and forth at ritual occasions in order to maintain the bond, maintain the relationship between villages, so that at some point in the future, perhaps, if one village is hit by a disaster, they have people they can call upon farther away who are okay. So scaling up is possible. Another example is scaling up a little bit, or at least having diverse risk pooling partners. Michael Bolig is a German anthropologist who studied risk pooling systems in Namibia with the Himba and in Kenya with the Pokot. And he was, in a sense, lucky with the Pokot that he was there during a drought, so he could see how the risk pooling system handled the drought. And one of the things he was able to document was that despite the drought, some of the people's herds increased. So these would have been people, I would guess, at high altitudes, because at high altitudes, you get more rain. And so they were doing okay and their herds increased. So they're able to help other folks. And I've got a few other considerations. Do I have time for them or I pass time?
The students had to leave for class, but we all can hang out.
Okay, these won't take too long, I don't think. Okay, so other considerations, we didn't include this as a design principle because we don't think it's essential, but if you can pull it off, you might want to try that, which is to make the system sacred in some way, connect it with the supernatural in some way. So on the left-hand side, you've got the Maasai. That's the guy from my field site with his goats. The mother-infant bond that the metaphor evokes is a sort of sacredness. So they don't explicitly bring in the supernatural, but it's sort of subtly brought in through that evocative word. And the Ik are a group of people, don't think I've talked about them yet. They live in far northeastern Uganda. And we have a postdoc, Catherine Townsend, who studied them as part of our project. And one of the things she found was that they have a belief in earth spirits called Kijowika, that they live on the landscape, you can't see them, and they monitor human behavior. They punish people who are greedy, people who are stingy, and they reward people who are generous. And so there's a certain supernatural punishment being evoked there. And she's able to show, just dwell on this for a moment, to see, does this have any real effect on behavior? She ran a dictator game. So basically, dictator game means it's not a game. It's an experiment where you give people money and say, you can keep all this money or you can give any portion of it to some other individual. So she had a baseline and they performed in the baseline games where there's no framing, on average the same as everybody else in the world, about 25%. And then she had a framing where it was specified that the individual would be needy. Now, from our point of view, every ick is needy. They're quite poor from our perspective, but that evoked a little bit more generosity. And then she had a framing where she said, well, before we play this game, tell me what you know about the Kijowik. So get them talking and thinking about that. That increases the generosity a little bit too. And the thing that jacked up the generosity all the way from 25% to 40%, if I recall correctly, was to say there will be a needy recipient, and tell me what you know about the Kijowik. Put both of those things in there and boom, their generosity shoots up. So it seems to have an effect. Yeah.
You know, the New Testament is all about parables. You know,
yep.
Trying to make a religious aspect, being generous is good.
Yep. It's a very common thing in many religions. Yeah. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Yeah, very common thing in many religions. Yeah. So the healthcare sharing ministries, they're mostly Christian. Some describe themselves as Judeo-Christian, and one is explicitly Jewish. But again, mostly Christian, and they all see that as essential to the whole thing. And so this is part of that system as well. Number two, there was at least another one. Risk-pooling systems can fail when pushed too hard, but they can also be revived. So among the Maasai, this was documented by a historian named Waller, in the early 20th century, they went through a period called the emutai, the wiping out. And I have a Maasai student, I asked him, I didn't know this word. I said, is this a general word that you can use in other contexts? Like you want to wipe out the weeds in your yard? He's like, yeah, you could use it. So it's just the wiping out. And what it means is that there was a lot of disease, a lot of drought all at one time. It was devastating. And there was, as a result, a lot of warfare among people and a lot of falling apart of relationships. But once they recovered from that, all these things came back. The osteotosis system came back afterwards. On the right-hand side, the ick. So they experienced a severe famine and starvation, and many of them starved to death in the early 1960s. The reason was that the British and colonial authorities had decided to create a national park in their traditional hunting lands. And I've been there, I've been to national park. And they were very rich hunting lands. They had the biggest herds of buffalo and hartebeest I've ever seen, just amazing numbers of animals. But they had no access to that anymore, thanks to the government. And they were starving. And the reason we know they were starving, but that came back. Like Catherine Townsend went there just a few years ago. They're very generous people. They have an ethic of sharing. One of their favorite sayings is "Tomorrow Marang," which means it's good to share. So just like most hunting and gathering peoples, they believe in sharing. All of them. I don't think any one of those groups has been documented that doesn't. But the reason we know all about this is a bit of an aside, but I think it's kind of an important aside, is because of this book, The Mountain People, by Colin Turnbull. So the reason why these folks were in our project was that one of the reviewers for the Templeton Foundation said, okay, it looks like you're cherry picking groups that are known to be generous. Maybe you should include a group that is known or thought to be stingy. And so I thought about that and thought, well, most of the time, those kinds of attributions are just pejorative stereotypes, so you can't trust them. But here we've got an ethnographer, at one time a very esteemed ethnographer, Colin Turnbull, who said, these are the most horrible people on earth. They are so stingy, so mean, they're terrible. He thought they were so awful, and he thought that this was because of their culture. he didn't have a theory of behavior that went beyond culture makes people do stuff. So if culture makes people do stuff, then it must be their culture, and therefore the best thing for the Ugandan government to do, according to him in the book, is take the Ik people, divide them up into groups of no more than 10, without regard to family ties, and distribute them all around the country so that their culture and their language will die out. It is a really strange thing for an anthropologist to say. And it shocked a lot of people, but there were very famous people who endorsed it and who got, put quotes on the back of the book, like Margaret Mead, people like that. But he was wrong. What was missing from his perspective, they were starving to death. He knew that. But it wasn't because of their culture. It was because of British colonial policies. And when you are starving to death, you behave very differently than when you're not. You start being very stingy and thinking only about food. And so this has been documented through experiments on volunteers. And so he just missed it, big picture that they were actually very generous people. They just couldn't be generous. They were in a terrible situation. So moving on from the ick. If you can manage risk in other ways, if you have more wealth thanks to changes in your economy, you're getting some cash, you can manage risk in other ways. And so risk pooling might decline. And this might not be a terrible thing. I don't think risk pooling is has to exist everywhere and is amazing. I do think they're pretty clever, but so this has been documented by a different team, Baird and Gray, among the Masai in Tanzania, who said that livelihood diversification, meaning going off and getting jobs primarily, leads to reductions in inter-household exchanges, including help with restocking. These are not folks who know the ethnographic literature very well, so they didn't use the word osotwa, but that's what they're talking about. So osotwa giving reduces when people have other ways to make a living. And I think, big picture, that's okay. And among the Fulani in Nigeria, a Nigerian investigator found that, yes, the same thing happening there. They were pastoralists, they had risk pools, but as they get wealthier, wealth differences have increased and risk pooling has diminished. And they've been replaced to some extent with patron-client relationships. So a hierarchy developing. That might not be so great. And then finally, that's the team again, and that's the funding source. And now I'm done. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so we ran a little late over time there, but yeah, please, Carl.
So relatedness must play a large role in how well.
Yeah.
Left it under the rug.
Yeah, well, that was kind of deliberate because I'll just talk about. Yeah. So one thing we found among the ranchers that I wouldn't say it surprised us, but we didn't think to include it in our set of predictions, we should have, was that relatedness would play a role in who helps who. So the people with more relatives locally are more likely to engage in more helping of other ranchers. So it does play a role among the ranchers, clearly. It didn't come up in people's interviews. And so we didn't make it one of our primary predictions. Among the Maasai, yeah, they help relatives all the time. They help their blood relatives, they help their in-laws. But that's sort of, the osotwa thing is kind of on top of that. So in addition to people that you're not closely related to. So your osotwa partners are typically, yeah.
Separate the relatedness.
I don't have data on actual gifts. But so your relatives already have an obligation to help you if you're in need. So this is sort of on top of that, in the sense that you want to form osotwa relationships with people who don't already have an obligation to help you. So you seek those out among people that, well, you may not be totally unrelated to them because typically there's some distant relationship no matter where you look, but that you're not closely related to. You get that relationship with them. So yes, kinship definitely plays a big role in who helps who in all these societies. But so this is sort of an extra layer on top of that, so that you're not completely reliant upon kin. You've got some other folks you can, like the Sharo partners. Among the Juntuansi or the Kung, the Sharo partners, they may be distant relatives, but I think if I remember Polly's work correctly, they aren't close relatives. You get those partnerships with people that you're not already connected to. You're not already obligated to help. So yeah, kinship is huge. This is extra on top of that. Just like, even in our society, we rely upon kin all the time, maybe not as heavily as these folks, but we also get insurance policies. We do both. Yeah. Yeah, Laura, sorry.
So, sort of the same question.
Yeah.
I was puzzled that, especially among the writers, there were people who were predisposed to it all the time. And
That's what they say.
And
Or never to.
that was
The difference was whether they expect repayment or not.
okay, but there were good people and there were really people.
There were some people who would in our interviews and also in the surveys who would say, under no circumstances do I ever expect repayment. And, I wonder to what extent that's really the case or whether that's self-deception. I don't know whether it is. I don't have enough behavioral data on what they actually do to be able to tell you. And then there's folks who are like, no, whatever happens, whenever I give help, I expect repayment. We made a mistake in the survey of the ranchers and that we didn't distinguish between expecting repayment, but only if the same thing happens to you. Like you help somebody because they got injured on their ranch and you expect repayment, but only if you also get injured on your ranch. We didn't distinguish well enough. So that's in the second survey we did of people more broadly, we did. And that, I think if I remember the results correctly, it worked to make that split apart. But yeah, there's some people, again, whenever you do a survey, you're gonna get some people who aren't paying much attention and who go, yeah, sure. So there's noise. But the general tendency is what we predicted overall. Yeah.
Thank you for that really wonderful talk.
Oh, thanks.
Enjoyed it. I feel as though you made a really nice case against the naive view that behavior is determined by culture.
Yeah.
But I think with the example.
Or only by culture. I think it is determined by culture to some extent.
But in
yeah.
some, domineering kind of way.
Yeah.
But I think the same point could be made, and maybe you disagree, and that's the question.
Yeah.
That behavior isn't so much determined by an evolved psychology of humans are pro-social or they like to help people in need, but that too is kind of.
That's contingent on circumstance.
It's just as off base as the cultural determinism, because actually behavior is very context dependent.
Yes.
Dependent on whether there's a payoff, dependent on whether you're related to somebody, dependent on whether they're in your web of reciprocators.
Right.
And
all that. I agree with all that.
It seems as though there's such tendency in this field, broadly described, to say, well, humans are pro-social or humans have XYZ evolved psychology. Whereas what you've shown is just how it really is super contingent.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I agree completely. We have the capacity to be pro-social and we have the capacity to be antisocial, and it depends on the circumstance. And culture plays a role, but it's not the only thing that plays a role. Sometimes it plays a huge role. Sometimes it plays a very minor role. And I have other data from other studies that address that stuff more effectively than this stuff does, because we didn't really go into this with that question in mind. Is this being determined by culture or is this being determined by something else? That wasn't the driving question. It was just, how do risk pooling systems work? That was the driving question. But yeah, I can't think of anything you just said that I don't agree with. I think I agree with all that stuff. Yeah. Which is to say, let's be sophisticated about our approach. Yeah. So like Turnbull's approach, very common, even now, I think, among culture anthropologists, is just to say, whatever people do, they do it because culture makes them do it. It's just very, very simple-minded, to my mind. Anyway, yeah.
So for that, is that how you say it?
Oh, that's fine. Also, toi. Yeah.
Does someone ever cut off their partner if they're consistently?
They're not supposed to. According to my interviewees and according to, again, what I know about this comes to the people I interviewed back in 2005. And from my student, Dennis, who I interviewed, he is Maasai, and he interviewed Maasai elders about it a few years ago. And then more anecdotally from a new Maasai student I have named Stephen, he's not studying this stuff, but he and I talk about it a lot. So based on all that stuff, the claim they make is that these relationships are considered so serious, so sacred, that people will follow the rules of the system and never break them. They consistently, they say they can't imagine anybody breaking the rules. Because, I mean, it may be that people are starting to, because resources are becoming easier to hide, because they're getting wealth and they have a bank account and you can hide other forms of wealth. And my most recent student, Stephen, does say that he thinks that younger people are using the term osotwa in a more loose way. They may use it for friends who are not strictly formal osotwa partners. The word always has been used in a variety of contexts. I've just talked about one context, but like they've always also used it, like if two groups back in the olden days when there was warfare, had engaged in warfare and then made a peace treaty, they referred to that bond, that peace treaty bond, as osotwa. So it's used in other contexts, and Stephen anyway thinks it's the younger generation is using the word more loosely. So that may reflect a change, a cultural change as things goes by, and the young people are the same people who have, you know, less livestock and more bank accounts. So all this cultural stuff is going to change, and sometimes very rapidly. Yeah, they're bilateral relationships. So, you know, everybody will have half a dozen or 8 or 10 osotwa partners, and then they'll have, so you get a big network across the landscape. That's the idea. Yeah, yeah. But they're dyadic relationships. Yeah.
But people know that he and she or he and he.
Yeah, it's not secret. It's not secret. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. We didn't talk about that, but we talked about it earlier. Absolutely. People care what other people think about them. And you would not want to be caught as the person who is cheating in one of these systems. Yeah.
I just have a similar question for ranchers.
Yeah.
Did a rancher that was consistently requesting help, even if they didn't need it,
Yeah.
would they ever get excluded?
Yeah, they'll get excluded. According to, I had one particular interviewee who was, he's a kind of a famous guy. He's got one of the MacArthur Genius Awards for work he's done with sustainability out there. So great guy to talk to because he's thought about all this stuff deeply. And he says, yes, there have been examples of families who owned ranches and they just never stepped up and helped anybody else. And they got isolated and nobody would help them. So in that case, yeah, they don't have the osotwa framework again, it's not a written framework, but it's a very formal framework. And the ranchers don't have that. It's informal ideas, cultural ideas about stuff. But yeah, they at least one family got cut off because people got fed up with how they weren't reciprocating. And then there's also, I didn't mention this, but this speaks to the reputation kind of thing and people's desire to have a good reputation. One of the ways in which you are supposed to reciprocate for people giving you help is you feed them. If you're having people over to help you on your ranch, to help you brand or whatever, you have to feed them. Everybody knows that. And he knew a guy, he didn't tell me who it was, but somebody who had failed to do that. He'd had people over to help with the branding, and for whatever reason, he had failed to feed them. And he realized he had, committed a faux pas, and he said he was ashamed and mortified for years to come that he had done that. He couldn't, and it wasn't necessarily the case that other people were talking about him, but that's what he was afraid of, reputation. Yeah. Yeah.
So, in the osotwa,
oh, you know what I forgot to do? Turn the microphone on. So I'm sorry to everybody watching this, but the ceiling mic is now on. So sorry if those earlier questions didn't show up on the tape. This is being taped. But now this one will. Your question will be on the tape.
Wonderful. So you said people often have like half a dozen or more of these relationships.
Roughly that number, yeah.
How do they kind of manage who they're getting help from? Like if they're in a situation, do they ask all of their partners for help?
So again, this is anecdotal. We wish we had a lot more quantitative data on exactly this, give us a list and so on. But that just hasn't transpired due to basically staffing issues, who's there to ask the questions. Anecdotally, what we hear from people is that they will typically think about who is in the best position to help. So they'll go to their wealthiest partner. So that's what when we did the network simulations, So in that case, you've got not just one individual to ask for help from, but 6 or 8 or 10 or more individuals to ask for help from. We programmed the agents so that they would always go to the richest one and they work their way down. So, because that's what we heard from, again, from interviews. Be great to have actual quantitative data showing that, but that's tough to get. Yeah. But at least anecdotally, that's what we think happens. I'll let Max go ahead. Yeah.
Across some of the study contexts you've looked at, there kind of seem to be sometimes different, like overarching modes of production, hunter-gatherers, and then capitalism for the ranchers. And are there differences that have kind of in these principles, or how they're kind of enacted that kind of are across those lines?
Yeah, well, in some cases, people don't do a lot of risk pooling because they don't have to, because they live in an environment where there's not much volatility. So like in a subsistence mode where you've got ample rainfall, good soils, we don't have any societies like that in our sample. We've got, pastoralists in marginal environments and one hunter-gatherer group, the Hadza in a pretty marginal environment. So yes, our study doesn't capture all the variation. Beyond that, and again, you've got some societies, the ranchers are kind of unusual in that they do have a risk pooling system that's crucial in their way of life. Most Americans, we get by from day to day without having to have that. We have insurance policies, we have wealth that we can just go to the bank and get some money out if we need it. It's just the economy works in a different way. But I think there's some underlying psychology that's still there to be tapped into. Like some of the experiments have tapped into that if you have people imagine that they are in this situation, they respond to it in a way that indicates they get it. That if things are volatile, if things are unpredictable, that's different from how I live my life, but I get it and I will help those in need. And we've got other experiments, other game experiments where and I talked about these, I think, when I was here like 12 years ago, whatever it was. We had people in Kenya play certain experimental economic games with and without an Osoto framing. So to see, well, what do they do? So they play the game very differently if they're told it's an Osoto game than if they're not. So that's cool. Then we did the same thing with Americans. We said, okay, here's this Osoto system, here's how it works. Play this game with and without the framing. Replicated the behavior. So Americans, within 15 minutes of reading about the Osoto system, play the game. So to the extent to which the gameplay reflects anything real about their behavior, they play them not exactly, but almost exactly like the Messiah did. So yes, there are cross-cultural differences because we're such a diverse species, but I feel like this is pretty easy stuff for people to get. It's not tough. Yeah.
Did you say the Osoto partners identify each other as children already?
Well, sometimes. That's
That
one
makes
way.
sense.
Sometimes it happens that way, yeah. Another way, there's a variety of ways. The ones I know about are that one.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you're a boy, and this typically happens when they're about 14, they get circumcised. And nowadays this is happening more and more in hospitals. But when I was there in the 80s and even now, traditionally it doesn't happen in a hospital, it happens just at home. And you are not supposed to show any pain. And so to help you with the process, you ask some older guy to be the guy who holds your back. They have names for these guys. And the guy who holds your legs. And those, if they agree to do that, then those become your Osoto partners as well.
An older person then?
Yeah, sometimes they're not your same age, yeah. And then if you get married.
You're already asking somebody whom you trust. So.
Yes. So it's some older guy who is somebody that you respect, yeah. And then if you get married, you have a best man, and he doesn't arrange a party. There's no bachelor party or anything like that. The wedding is called the leading of the bride, where she's being led by the groom and the best man from her natal household to her marital household, which might be miles away. Mm-hmm. And her role in this little bit of theater is to act very reluctant to go, which may be true, she may be. So she goes very, very slowly and very slowly, and she uses anything on the path as an excuse to stop. So the groom and the groomsman, the best man, have to use brushes to clear the path. And for this, and again, it might go on for miles. So it's a big onerous responsibility, but that creates an social bond. If a guy agrees to be your best man, then you two are social.
And there's already a relationship.
Yeah, he's already somebody you know. Yeah, he's already somebody you know. Yeah, he's your buddy. Yeah, but there's a category of friend who is a friend, a buddy. That's ulchore. But an ulchore, you might have a lot of ulchores, choreta. But they're not all your social partners. There's a difference. So a guy you would like to hang out with because he's your buddy is a different category of person from an social partner. Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you know Dan Pershia? Some of you know Dan Pershia. He's at Arizona State, wrote a book on friendship around the world, cross-cultural analysis of friendship and how it varies around the world. And he worked that in as an example of how there's different kinds of friends in different societies. And that's one example of that. Yeah.
Do you have any data on if like certain guys want to be with like OSA-12 partners with wealthier men than them? Or
I don't know. That's a good question.
Other like ones might want to refuse having poorer.
Yeah, I don't have any data on that. I mean, you don't, if somebody proposes that they want to be your OSA partner, you don't have to say yes. So if I had data on that, then yeah, I would predict that there would be a selectivity based on wealth. But as I said, they're because of the residential segregation, the poor people live with the poor people, and the rich people live with the rich people. And they don't, I got confirmed this with my student, Stephen. My student, Stephen, is from the wealthy group. And we have a sort of teasing relationship because he is deeply steeped in Maasai culture and beliefs and has nothing but contempt and disdain for these poor people. It's like, it's their fault. But he's funny about it. So it's sort of a joking thing between him and me. And I confirmed with him actually just last week, I think it was, that indeed they know the people in the poor groups. They have relationships with those people, sometimes positive, friendly relationships, right? Friendships, but they don't form orthodox relationships with them. Because if they did, who's going to be in need? The poor people are going to be in need all the time. So the poor people form their own relationships among themselves, and the rich people do among themselves. And so there is a selectivity based on wealth. So much so that I think it wouldn't even be proposed. Like, would a poor guy go from one of these? They have a word for these folks, the poor people, which is a derogatory term. If you ask somebody like Stephen, he'll say, well, it's who they are. It's just describing them. But it's perceived as being highly derogatory by the people that it's directed at. If one of the Dorobo had the temerity to ask for a OSA relationship with one of the wealthy people, I don't think it would go. So again, it's anecdotal, but I think you're on the right track. Yeah.
I'm curious more about the social structure of these ranchers. So 12% answered this survey, and their average age was early 60s,
Yes.
I believe I'm correct.
Yeah,
and their household size was about 2.3
Yeah,
persons.
It's not
so
a
are
way.
these sort of like couples whose kids have grown up?
Mostly.
And are they living neolocally, and how far away? And
Mostly pretty close, but I don't have again, this anecdotal data. Yeah, the age of the ranchers, the respondents to the ranch survey were old, tended to be. And that reflects kind of how ranching is going. It's a hard way to make a living. A lot of people are leaving it.
right, but can they be viable, or are they sort of retired, or
It ranges. So a lot of them, most of the ranchers are not 100% ranchers. So not quite all of them, but a very large proportion of them have other ways to make a living as well. So there's school teachers and people. There's a big. This happens to be a really good area for birding, and so they get birding tourists coming in, and so there's a fairly large business of running B&Bs for the birders. That's a thing people do. So they have lots of other ways to make money. small businesses, some of them work with realtors.
How big are their herds?
You can't ask that question.
Oh, yeah,
So,
but
yeah.
do you have a feeling?
No, a few hundred, 2,000.
Oh, that's huge.
Yeah, something like that. But that was one of the things we did interviews with them, and then we made up a survey. It was a very rough survey, way too long. And then we went back and we ran the survey past a few people who were really good interviewees. And one of the things they told us was you can ask how big a ranch is in terms of sections, square miles. You can't ask number of animals. That's rude. You don't ask that. So an actual number, I don't know for sure. There are a couple of books about ranchers, including one pretty good one about ranchers in another part of Arizona. And that book, I have it in my office. That book might have data on that. But I wasn't able to ask that question.
Well, it also partly feeds into whether they're neighbors or relatives, because they're obviously
Yeah.
not living in their own household.
Right.
Which I assume is mostly a couple.
Yeah, a couple, sometimes with a grown kid or a couple of grown kids, yeah, depending on the household. Yeah,
But on average, not much more than 2 people.
yeah, they're small. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. These aren't big households or big. They're big in terms of numbers of square miles, because again, the land is so unproductive. But they're not big operations, big commercial operations. And a lot of these people cling to it because they like the way of life, even though it's not economically, maybe sustainable in terms of the environment, because there's so few cows, so much land, but not sustainable economically, just because it's hard to sell enough cows to make a real living. But they like the way of life. They just love being out there, being with the horses, being with the cattle, that kind of stuff. So a lot of them stick to it for that sort of emotional and cultural reason, not because they're making money.
But their kids are gravitating
Yeah.
away.
Yeah, mostly.
Are there any more questions? Just a comment if anybody has one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think your Maasai story gives a clue about what's different between Denmark and
Okay.
the US.
Oh, the wealth thing.
Well, it's the Danes have a history of being more, they don't have the history we have of always defining an outgroup.
Mm.
Right? So that we've got that built into our culture. So it's only within the in-group.
Because the Danes are sort of homogenous.
They used to be, yeah.
Yeah, they used to be, right.
So they have a culture that's much more,
Day for day.
includes everyone as,
But again, Michael Bay Peterson found that so information about what group, sort of ethnic identity, group identity, was not included in the vignettes. It was just some guy.
but you measured in the values.
But again, Americans and Danes responded the same way to that question.
Right, but if you'd ask, they would use the same, Americans would say the same thing that Mossad did, which is those people are poor because they are lazy, so they are not within our,
Well, that was one of the vignettes, was somebody's needy because he's lazy. But Americans may be more likely to attribute that to those folks over there.
those folks, the ones who are poor, whereas the Danes have a much deeper system of helping and assuming you need 7 years to get through a 4-year program and we'll pay your way though.
Something like that,
Forgetting about
So
Greenland.
I've only been in Denmark, so.
well, they did call it Greenland, yeah. So that's reminding me of the Karen framework. And so within that framework, I guess I would say you're tapping into the identity part of that, the I. That, are those people the same group as me? Okay, I'll be a little more lenient with those folks. That's one of their findings anyway. Yes.
Okay, we're going to give you a break, Lee.
Okay, thanks.
Right. Beer, you're on this.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Sam. Okay, I'm gonna turn this off. I guess